You're listening to That's the Hashtag Truth with Daniel and Jenny Muscatel, where we let real people get real honest about the bottom line.
So today joining us, we have retired customer service executive Edward Gangi, who was born and raised in New York City. He and his wife now live in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Ed is the author of published nonfiction articles as well as short stories. He is a popular book club presenter and podcast guest. The Gift Best Given, a memoir, is his first full-length book, and you can learn more about Ed on his website at www.thegangiauthor.com. Ed, welcome.
Jenny, thank you so much for having me join you.
Oh, we have really been looking forward to this. I just have to say, one, I love the title of your book. It immediately grabs my interest. But two, memoirs are always my personal favorite genre.
Me too.
And I just love personal stories. And so I've really been looking forward to hearing more about yours. Do you want to tell us, I guess, just a little bit about who you are and kind of what led you to write your memoir?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I live in North Carolina with my wife, Linda.
Mhm.
We have one son who is now 32, which seems impossible. And he was married back in the fall to Renee. So we have a son and a new daughter-in-law. And happily, they live fairly close by. So it's nice. I was brought up in New York City and have traveled from New York City. We lived in Houston, Texas for 12 years. We then moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, lived there 13 years. And we've now been in Hillsborough, North Carolina for 10. So it's been a journey and we've loved every stop. We're hoping that Hillsborough is our final destination. We're really we're pleased to be here, and it's just a great community. I was an adoptee. I was adopted at the time of my birth, and my adoptive parents brought me home from the hospital at a day old. So they were the only parents that I ever knew.
Yeah.
And interestingly, to the best of my recollection, they never mentioned to me that I was adopted.
Oh, wow.
I one day prowling through papers and things, I happened to come across my birth certificate, which was labeled Certificate of Birth by Adoption.
Okay.
And that kind of revealed things to me, but I don't know. I think it really didn't mean a lot because, as I said, they were the only parents I ever knew. And I had this feeling that, well, I guess if they're not talking about it, neither should I. So I never questioned it.
Yeah.
And, my adoptive dad died in 1976, my adoptive mother in 1987. And to the time of their deaths, we never talked about it, but I knew. And, and honestly, it never really mattered to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then, it's as I was approaching my 70th birthday, I sort of got a little nudge and a little bit of an itch. And I said, it'd be kind of interesting to know, genetically, but biologically, where did I really come from?
Yeah.
And that started this journey.
Was there anything specific that kind of brought that itch there? Was there a...
Well, coincidentally, I don't know if it's coincidence or not. We were up in New Jersey, and my wife's parents had moved from New Jersey down here to North Carolina to be closer to us. And sadly, in a fairly short amount of time, both of them passed away. And we were up there to inter my father-in-law's remains.
Yeah.
And nearby the cemetery where his remains were being interred was the cemetery where my adoptive mother's family were all interred. They were from the Ukraine, and this was a Russian Orthodox cemetery. And we went over there to visit thinking, it's unlikely that there will be another opportunity to do that. And I was standing over the grave of my mother's parents and started thinking it would be really interesting to know more about where they came from, about their Ukrainian background.
Yeah.
And that was kind of spurred by a couple of things. Ancestry.com was advertising like crazy, say, just send us your DNA. We'll tell you your whole life story. Yeah, maybe not quite that simple, but there was an implication there. And the other piece was I had been reading a book, and I think I was reading it for the third time, which was called The Search for Six of 6 Million. And it was written by an author who was a professor up at Bard College in New York, and a very well-respected journalist and a classicist. And he went on a search to find out what had happened to 6 distant family members who perished in the Holocaust. And, he knew the big story. He knew what the Holocaust was all about, but he wanted the specifics of what happened to each of those 6 people.
Yeah.
And he traveled the world to make contact with the very small handful of people who actually had come from their village and who were still alive. And it was a fascinating story. And I'm thinking I may go back and read it now for the 4th time. And, I've always said it's kind of a combination of a detective story, a biblical recitation, because his search is interleaved with passages from the Old Testament. And it's a genealogical search. And he, by the end, had found precisely what happened to each of those 6 people. So that had me kind of, I'm thinking, okay, his family came from the Ukraine. My adoptive family came from the Ukraine. He and I have common things. The only thing I didn't have was a very big advance from a book publisher to go and travel the world trying to find this out. But I came home. We came home to North Carolina, and I went to our local library, got on Ancestry.com, started putting in my grandparents' names, came up with a fairly sizable amount of information. And for the first time, I sat there and I was thinking, if it's this easy to find out about them, I wonder what I could find out about me and the people who had placed me for adoption. And I was very blessed in that my adoption had been privately arranged back in 1948, and everybody sort of knew everybody.
Right.
And the paperwork from that adoption was still available to me. My mother had saved it, and I had looked at it maybe once or twice as I grew up, and always put it back in the envelope and filed it back away. And I knew I still had it. And I left the library, came home, took out that envelope, and there was basically it was my adoption decree. It had my adoptive parents' names on it. It had the name of their attorney, and I don't know why in the world I have always known that name. And it had a 4th name on it, which was not one I recognized. And intuitively, I knew that had to be my birth mother. So I wrote that down name, and I got back in the car and went back to the library, and I got back on Ancestry, and I typed her name in, and I sat there for a minute, not quite knowing, did I want to go forward with this?
Yeah.
And eventually I did. I hit that enter button, and a screen full of listing, documents came up, and there were census records and all sorts of things. But the one I chose to click on was a visa application dated about 10 months after my birth, which was for travel between Miami, Florida, and Rio de Janeiro. And I had no clue. I said, what could she possibly be doing? And I had all sorts of exotic thoughts. Well, she was a foreign spy and all sorts of things. But I hit that button, and and the application came up. It was written in Portuguese, but completed in English, with all of her information. It had a lot of family information on it. I had always assumed my mother was the high school girl who accidentally became pregnant and was sent away and the baby taken from her. But what I found out is at the time I was born, she was 23 years old.
Mm-hmm.
and it listed her occupation as an artista.
Mhm.
Yeah, which did me no good. But at least at that point I knew, she was not a high school girl. She was not a teenager. She was a young adult woman. And it also had her picture there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, and that was kind of a remarkable moment, is sort of looking in the screen and seeing your mother looking back at you.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole journey really began. And it was that piece that said artista that kind of drew me in. I'd always said, if my mother was the high school girl who went on to work at the post office or at the local dry cleaner or the Five and Dime,
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't be talking. There really, there wouldn't have been nearly so interesting a story.
Yeah.
But I saw artista there, and that's where I started to plot forward.
So you have, I mean, you're talking about this, and I hear some really big moments in this journey that stand out. One, I can totally see why the chain of events that sparked your interest would spark your interest. It does have that detective flair to it, but also that piece of this history that, gosh, what if you uncover it, and what is it about? And it's part of you. And when you're looking at that birth certificate, after you have this awareness of, what, I think I want to look this up. I think I want to find out who my mom is, my birth mom is. And you're looking at that birth certificate for the first time in a long time, and you see this name and it's hers. What did you think in that moment?
I don't know. Again, I looked at that name and I saw that high school girl.
Yes.
Yeah, that's about all I could say. I was fortunate in that and this is different than a lot of adoptees. I had no ill will about having been placed for adoption.
Right.
A
Yeah.
lot of adoptees they feel abandoned, they feel discarded. I never had that feeling, and I attribute that to my adoptive parents.
Yeah.
They just felt me, they just made me feel loved and embraced, and I had no reason to think otherwise.
Yeah.
And maybe it's my nature. I think if had I thought it through, I probably would have said, there was a reason why this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And contrary to that, though, I seldom thought about my birth mother. I seldom had that thought as I grew up. I bet you wonder who she was. I almost never thought about who my birth father may have been.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of just blew him off. My logic was, if she was the high school girl who got in trouble, he was the guy who pumped gas at the gas station, and he didn't matter.
Mm.
And and ultimately I found out more about him as well.
Oh my goodness, I can't wait to hear more about that too. So, you have this moment, you're kind of like, well, this is probably who my mom is. This is probably the situation at hand. And then you go on and you're like, wait a minute, there's this travel situation that's happening from one place to a very far distant place. And there's this word artista. Like you said, that sparked some interest. Like, what does that mean? And where did you go next? What was your next step in
Well,
that journey?
if I had pulled up the record and saw she was 16 years old, I probably would have shut Ancestry down and would have said, okay, that's the whole story.
Yeah.
It would have validated what I originally suspected. But I saw she was 23. I saw she was an artista. And that said, you have got to look farther. And, and as I said, there was a page full of documents there. And I ran home with that document to show it to my wife and say, do you want to see my mother? Do you want to see my mother? And and she and my adoptive mother were very close. She said, we've got pictures of your mother every place. I said, no, not that mother.
Mm.
And, and once we were sort of by that, the next day I was back to the library, back on that same list of documents. And I found my birth mother's marriage license. She got married 7 years after surrendering me for adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of revealed more. It listed her as a performer. And it listed her birth name. It listed her married name. and it listed another name, which I later found out was a stage name. And yeah, so then I had that to work with. So Genevieve Knorowski, who was the Polish girl from Flushing, Queens, turned into Genevieve Norris, performer. And I Googled that, and what came up was a blog from an antiques dealer in South Carolina. And the blog posting basically said, yes, it was written at the time, I guess, that this occurred, which was, I think 3 or 4 years prior to my actually searching. And it said, my partner and I were at an auction in Marietta, Georgia, and we bought all of these items, which were produced by Genevieve Norris and her husband, Ted Meza,
Wow.
who owned Ted Meza or owned Mez Art Studios, a producer of props for ice skating shows and theatrical events and commercial use. And she then went on to explain that Genevieve Norris had been an ice skater, and her husband had been a performer in the ice skating shows as well.
Yep.
So, so I immediately reached out to her, but then I went and Googled some more, and I put in Genevieve Norris ice skater. And another blog came up from a woman who had been at the same auction. And that blog probably had, I'm thinking, half a dozen photographs of my mother at various stages in her career,
Yeah.
along with a copy of her first professional contract, a copy of her middle school diploma.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there sort of holding my head, look at this. And yeah, I was able to make contact with that first antiques dealer about those big items, but what I found out is that second woman had purchased a copy, just a carton, like you would get copy paper in, of quote unquote ephemera, just loose items, of which that contract and diploma and photographs were part. And I reached out to her. I searched for her, and I found 3 people, I think, with the same name, but only one of them was in Marietta, Georgia, had an association with antiques. And I reached out to her, and as I did with anyone I was looking for at that point, I said, I'm exploring a possible family relationship to the woman whose pictures you have up. And a short while later, she messaged me back and said, yes, we've still got these items, which I thought was remarkable because, antiques dealers buy stuff to resell.
Yeah.
Right.
And, and she had just bought it out of curiosity. She thought it was a glamorous woman from a glamorous period. And she still did have them. She said, but I'm very busy right now. Can I get back to you? I'll be right back. I had little choice. I said, I'll wait to hear from you. And it went on for about a week, and I never heard from her. So I finally dropped the pretense, and I messaged her again and saying, I don't want to be a nuisance, but the woman whose pictures you have is my mother. And probably within about 5 minutes, the phone rang. And she said, I am so sorry. I forgot all about it.
Yeah.
You need to come here right now.
Oh.
And,
Wow.
and we're in North Carolina. She's in Georgia. But within about a week or so, my wife and I were in the car, and we were on our way to Georgia. And we met with she and her husband. They could not have been nicer people. And we've remained good friends with them. And and they brought this carton in along with a couple of smaller props that my mom and her husband had produced.
Oh, wow.
And we went through what was in the carton, and I came across a stack of publicity photographs from other ice skaters. And they were all autographed to my mother. And I was sort of going through that. I'm thinking to myself, if I can find one of these women, maybe I can find out more about my mother. So I'm sitting there writing down names, and Dan, who is the husband, said, what are you doing? And I explained what my rationale was, and he just sort of shook his head. No, he said, you don't need to do that. And he just pushed the carton across the table. He said, this belongs to you. We've just been holding it for you.
Oh.
And they just gifted it to us, which I think was one of the kindest and most generous things anyone had ever done for me.
Mhm.
And this has been a story about, serendipity, just potluck occurrences and other people's generosity,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
I think is a reflection on the type of person my birth mother was.
Mhm.
But we came away, or I came away with that stack of photographs, and I started looking, and sadly, either I found that the women were no longer alive, or I couldn't find any record. But I did find one woman, and I found an obituary for her husband,
Mhm.
and it identified him as the wife of Isabel Smith, ice skater with Ice Follies, and I couldn't find her, but it listed his two sons' names, and I found one of them and sent him the photostat of his mother's picture, the photostat of my mother's picture, and explained what it was why I was doing. And probably in a week or so, he called me back and he said, Mom is still alive and she wants to talk to you.
Oh my
Oh my
gosh,
goodness.
that's
So he's like, he gets
wow.
the information,
Oh,
brings
he
it
was
to his
into it. He
mom. He's
he
like,
got it. He unfolded it. He ran to the, what he said was, Mom wants to talk to you. And I was elated, and then he just took a pause and he said, there's just one thing. And I said, oh, and he said, Mom is in a memory care facility. And he must have heard, the pause at the other end of the line. And he said, but the good thing is, my mom doesn't know what she had for breakfast this morning, but she could tell you pretty much minute for minute what happened in 1947.
Oh wow.
yes.
So,
Yeah.
so I called her and we were on the phone for the better part of an hour. And she was just a delightful woman, so vivacious, so lively, a sense of humor. And I always joke that, she was also very flirtatious. When I got on the phone with her, I said, I understand that it's unfair to ask somebody who's 93 years old what happened in 1947. And you could hear her sort of, take a deep breath. She said, who told you I'm 93 years old? And I didn't say anything. She said, I'm 88. And I said, oh, okay. And then she said, as a matter of fact, I'm 85. Now I'm doing the math really quick. That would have made her about 10 years old when she was ice skating. But
yeah.
we had this wonderful conversation, and then at the end of the call, she said, now, how old did you say you were? I said, well, I'm just about to turn 70. She said, I'm 65. So a few months later, my wife and I actually flew out to Minnesota and we met her, and we spent
Oh,
4 or 5 hours with her, and she had cartons of her own memorabilia at the facility with her, and I was just on the floor surrounded with pictures and news clippings and albums and such, and it was a wonderful afternoon. It was a great experience.
wow.
The richness of the journey alone is just amazing. There's all these little blessings that I hear coming, or big blessings that I hear coming all throughout your journey. You have this, I mean, the chances, right, of this one antique dealer or whatnot that has all of this information, and then they excitedly give it to you because that heart of theirs, this belongs to you, and so they're part of this journey moving forward, and it's touching their lives. And then the son of this woman that you look up, what a gift for him to be able to go to his mom and have a connection, right? Because that happens so often with dementia and memory care issues, is
Yeah,
the short-term memory goes first, but the long-term memory stays intact for a very long time. And so what a point of connection to be able to be like, hey mom, guess what? And the
right.
life that they probably felt in that relationship alone. And then for her, no matter what age we get, no matter where we're at on that, um physically or mentally, whether we're losing our memory or those sort of things, in general, we want to be of help in this world. And so here's
Yeah,
this sweet woman who, yes, she has some short-term memory loss and is in a memory care unit, but she's taking the experiences she's had in her life and eagerly helping you.
Absolutely. It was a
And
very poignant moment as we left. She hugged us both and she said, "This is the best experience I've had in years."
Oh,
oh,
And I sincerely believe that because I
yeah,
think you get to be her age. Other than your sons or your children, there
yeah,
are not that many people left to come and visit you.
mhm.
And my wife just adores old people. She
me
said if
too.
we lived close by, she said this is the type of person I would come and visit every week. And she was a kind of woman because there was a great deal of interaction.
Mhm.
And it was, this whole journey has been punctuated by those kinds of, miraculous little discoveries. And it's what's made it so special.
Now, so you meet with her. What do you learn?
It was interesting. She told me two things, I guess, is one, she didn't know who my father was.
Yeah,
Mhm,
She knew my wife dated and actually, or my mother dated,
mhm.
and they had actually been roommates while they were both out in San Francisco at the time that I was conceived. And she pretty well convinced or conveyed that their relationships out there were, they were random relationships. She said, we left to go out, we left to laugh, we left to dance. She said most of all we wanted a good meal. And
They left
so
the
I
work.
that sort of left me with the feeling that okay, I was the byproduct of a summer romance, and I think that's very much the case.
Mhm,
um She also talked about the nature of my mother's ice skating. My mother was what they called an adagio performer. She performed with a male partner
mhm.
who basically would throw and spin and fling her all over the ice. And she just was bewildered. She said, "I cannot believe your mother did that, plus she was pregnant with you."
Oh my
oh
goodness.
wow,
And
Yeah.
apparently she did for at least some time. And so that was really it. Is interestingly, Isabel, this elderly woman, the I was conceived in San Francisco. Ice Follies would spend the summer there. They would then move to Los Angeles to start their season, which was a big media event,
Mhm.
and celebrities would come out. And while they were there, Isabel struck up a relationship with Ronald Reagan. So
oh,
that was her other little thing that she kind of dropped into the conversation. Well, when I had lunch with Ronald Reagan, he said,
I
so it
mean,
was,
why
yeah,
not work that in, right?
yeah, it was very interesting.
I love that. So now you've got a little bit more. You have this piece of information of, gosh, not only was my mom an artista, but she was this figure skater who did, or I don't know if that's the proper term, but she was a skater who had a partner. They're doing all these things. She was adventurous. She's traveled from, state to state and just out living life. I mean, she obviously was really brave and adventurous. What else did you learn about her?
Well, yeah, she was certainly brave and adventurous. And taking a little step back, her lifetime goal, or I'm not sure when we set lifetime goals, but her goal as a young woman was to become a professional ice skater.
Mm,
oh, okay,
And she was 17 years old when her parents and her family took her to Grand Central Station in New York City, put her on a train, and she traveled for 3.5 days alone
wow.
across the country in the midst of World War II to join an ice skating troupe in Vancouver, British Columbia. And that's how her career began. And, as you said, she traveled all over from that point.
Wow.
I think where the real courage and the real focus came from, yes, when ultimately she became pregnant unexpectedly and had decisions to make.
Yeah.
So that's, but the two went well together, and certainly after my birth and the time she surrendered me, she went on with life, and again a very focused and She had a direction she was going in.
Now, I know you said your mom never talked about your birth mom, and but did you ever find out, did they ever meet? Did they know each other?
I tell the story in my book about the circumstances of my adoption, and it was privately arranged. Genevieve, my birth mother, kept her pregnancy and my subsequent adoption a secret from everybody, with
Okay.
the exception of her eldest sister and her eldest sister's husband.
Mm,
And her husband was in the uh, video, or at that time, movie production business in New York City, and apparently had connections. He had also been a member of or enlisted in the Office of War Information during World War II.
mhm,
My adoptive parents worked for the Signal Corps, or were with the Signal Corps during World War II. And there was a common thread, a man by the name of Eddie Sens, who was a makeup artist and hairdresser for the motion picture industry. And the Signal Corps had taken over the Paramount movie studios in New York City during World War II. It's where Eddie Sens had been based.
mhm,
Charles, as a member of the Office of War Information, would have had comings and goings there. Both of my adoptive parents worked there for the duration of the Second World War. So the belief is that my parents and my mother's brother-in-law had this common connection, which was Eddie Sands.
yeah.
And so I picture a conversation one day with my parents, and my parents and Eddie Sands were quite good friends for a long time, and him knowing that they were looking to adopt a child. I picture a conversation between he and Charles, the brother-in-law, where he became aware that Charles knew somebody seeking to place a child for adoption, and Eddie saying, "Bingo, got it," and kind of putting the two entities together. Whether they ever met or not physically, I don't know. I don't, in my heart, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I never, with my extended family, with aunts, uncles, cousins, brought up my adoption either. I
Mhm,
figured if I wasn't talking with my parents, that wasn't the place to do it.
mhm,
As I was writing the book and coming to the end of the book, I had a female cousin who was very close to my adoptive parents. She was kind of the matriarch of the family. She was already in her 80s. And I decided, let me go for it. And I called her up one day, and we made the usual chit chat about it. How's the family and how are
Yeah.
you feeling? And then I just, out of the blue, I said, "Anne, what do you know about my adoption?" And I kind of expected to hear her hit the floor at that point, but she never missed a beat. She said, "I only know two things about your adoption. The first is your mother was an ice skater,"
mhm.
which came as a relief to me, because at least I knew I had chased down the right
Right.
person.
Right.
And she said, "And my mother went with your parents the day they picked you up at the hospital,"
Hmm.
Oh,
which I thought was interesting. But about 2 weeks later, Anne called me back again. She said, I thought about one more thing to do with your adoption. I said, "What was that?" She said, "You were named after Eddie Sens. He arranged your adoption."
Oh,
So
oh,
that kind of
wow.
pulled all the pieces
yeah.
together into one place.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of neat, and it really did it. I thought, at least at the time, that it kind of crossed all the T's and dotted the I's. And
A full
Yeah.
circle
uh,
moment.
Yeah.
yeah, probably a year later, I met my Charles's son, my cousin.
Mhm,
And every time I made contact with the cousin, and all of them were very welcoming. And I would ask them all, the same question right off the bat: "Did you know about the adoption?" And they all said, "If anybody in our family knew anything about Aunt Jenny having a baby, we all would have known."
Mm.
So, the secret was well guarded, but
Right.
Charles's son told me about how his father had a very, very paternal instinct when it came to my mother.
Mm.
He was 17 years older than she was, and he just, he protected her.
Mhm.
So he was the one who kind of shepherded her through the pregnancy and then the subsequent adoption. He knew the right people, and fortunately it worked out in a very good way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So at this point, you went from having this picture of your mom in high school. Now you're at this point, okay, with everything you've told us so far. You found out all this stuff. What emotions are you feeling at this point? Because you've uncovered a lot, and it's really a completely different story than you originally imagined in your head. What are you feeling?
I think some elation to find something with so much texture to it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Sadly, by the time I made some of these connections, I had learned that my birth mother was no longer alive.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so that was a disappointment. I think at that point, having had no real curiosity,
Yeah.
having come that close, I sort of had this picture, which I think a lot of people have, of walking through the door one day and saying, "Here I am."
Yeah.
And obviously that wasn't going to occur. I had learned a lot about her by that point, and I've always kind of said she lived every little girl's dream in the earlier parts of her life, and her life did not end all that happily. And it would have made me feel good. And this is not about me, or should not have been solely about me, but if I could have gotten in there and said, you made a very difficult and a courageous decision, I wanted you to know how well it turned out.
Mm.
And but I've got some spiritual feel that she knows, and then that she's probably always known.
Yeah.
But I've had the opportunity to get a glimpse at what my life might have been like,
Mhm.
and I'm rather happy it was the life that I lived. It's but again, had she made a different decision, her life would have been different as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say, but I enjoyed the story. Yeah, I enjoyed telling it. I enjoyed living it. It was an entertaining journey. It's much more interesting than the lady who worked at the post office.
Mhm.
Not that there's anything
Right.
wrong with that, but it was
Right.
much more of an adventure, and it certainly put me in touch with a lot of wonderful people. And as I said before, I think all of those people were so kind and generous,
Mhm.
the ones that knew her. And that was a reflection on her. They did that because that's what she would have done.
Yeah.
As you got to know her a bit through this process and know about her.
Absolutely.
Yes. Did you see her in you at all? Are there parts of you that you're like, "Oh, that's where I get that from?"
I think to some degree, she was I like to think that I'm kind and giving, and she certainly was a very kind and giving and generous person. We share some artistic instincts. Hers was, visual artistry. I tended to lean more toward, the literary as well as musical.
Yeah.
Uh, Interestingly, when I met my half brother, who was the first son from her marriage in 1956, we were talking, and I said something. Well, we were talking about some situation, and I said, "Well, everything happens for a reason." And he stopped. He said, "What did you say?" I said, "Well, everything happens for a reason." He said, "Well, my mama said that all the time." And I think a lot of people say that all the time, but it was another little connection at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. So you met your half brother. He didn't know by the sounds of it? Or
No, it's very interesting. It's at the bottom of that second antique dealer's blog, there was one name remaining, or one comment saying, I went to school with Mrs. Mez's sons, and we were good friends. And he may even have, no, he did not. But he said we were good friends and our families grew up side by side in church. And so I wanted to get a hold of him because I could not find my half brother, who I now knew was alive someplace.
Yeah.
And he ultimately, a different person put me in contact with that person on the blog, and the blog put me in touch with my half brother. And ultimately, when we finally talked, I explained our relationship, and there was a brief silence, and it's, okay, I've got to go and do something now, but I'll call you back. And there wasn't an acknowledgement, and he didn't call right back. And it took a little bit of hunting to get back in touch with him. And probably several times over a period of a few months, we would have the conversation. And he would say, now explain to me, what kind of kin are we? And I would explain that, you and I have different fathers, but we have the same mother. And he would then change the subject again.
It was an intimidating conversation to approach.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought about how delicate I would be if I had the opportunity to reunite with my mother. When it came to the half brother, I had sort of given up on that, and I just kind of barged in. So a few months later, we went down and we visited him in Georgia, where he lived, where his parents had lived, and we made arrangements. So we're going to go to Golden Corral for dinner. And I thought it was the perfect place because if anything got awkward, you could always go to the chocolate fountain or the salad bar or whatever and take a little bit of a break. And sure enough, we needed a couple of those breaks. But on the way home, again, he said, okay, now explain to me, what kind of kin are we? And I explained as I had 3 or 4 times prior. And as he had done prior, he just changed the subject. But we get back to his home. He went back to his bedroom and he came out with a big roll of posters like you would see in the lobby of a theater. He said, I don't know how what you're telling me could be true because my mama and my papa were always together. And he rolled out these posters, and I knew exactly where his mother was when I was conceived. I had no doubt, and I knew who was pretty much where his father had been. They had been with 2 different ice skating companies. And he rolled out this big poster for Holiday or Ice Follies, I think, in 1945, and had all the cast members' names. And he said, see, I'll show you. And, he kind of went down the list, which was alphabetical. And he got to his father, he says, see, there's Daddy. And then his finger went down and his mother wasn't there. So he let that roll up and he rolled out in 1946, same story. As he was rolling out in 1947, I said, Ted, she's not going to be there. In 1947, she was in San Francisco with Ice Follies, and he went and unrolled 47 any place. Again, it was the same story. And he kind of quietly rolled up the posters, took them back to the bedroom, came back out with a big photo album. And my birth mother kept a meticulous record of where she was and who she was with.
Oh, wow.
And when she was with them, and it was all in chronological order and little black and white. You guys are too young to remember little black and white brownie snapshots. But yeah, they started in 1942 when she got to Vancouver, and he got to 43, 44, 45. And as he was on 1946, I said, Ted, I said, I'm not sure what's there for 1947, but she was with Ice Follies in San Francisco in August of 1947 when I was conceived. And he flipped that page, and I'll hold this up. This is the cover to my book. This is a color photograph, which was in the middle of the page.
Mhm.
the only color photograph in the entire album. And it's listed San Francisco, California, August 1947. And
Wow.
he looked at it and he was quiet. He just folded it up, put the album away, and came back. He said, "You want a beer?" And so I let the conversation drop at this point, and we had the beer, and my wife and I went back to the hotel. And the next day I came back and I had a photostat of the adoption decree with his mother's signature on it. And by that point, I recognized the signature. Her signature had been on that first document I found,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and there was no question about it. And I said, "Ted, I said, just to reassure you, I'm not scamming you. I don't want anything from you.
Yeah.
I just want you to know this is a real story." I said, "I brought this document for you." I said, "Here's your mother's signature." And he recognized it instantaneously.
Yeah.
Mm.
And his friend who had put us together was with him that day. And so Ted looked at it and he handed it to his friend Kevin. And Kevin just kind of looked and shrugged his shoulders and handed it back. And Ted wanted to hand it back to me. I said, "It's a photostat." I said, "It's of no value to anybody than to you and me. If you'd like to keep it, that's fine."
Mhm.
And we kind of wrapped up our visit with not much more being said. And I think Wednesday or Thursday of that same week, he called me and he said, "Well, I showed that piece of paper to so and so." Ted had been in an assisted care facility. He had been in a very, very traumatic fire.
Mm.
He had met his wife who had had a stroke in the same facility. She was still there. So he went back and he showed the document to, I think, the administrator there, who he seemed to have trust in. And
Yeah.
he said, "Well, I showed it to Mike." And then he didn't say anymore. So what did Mike say? He said, "Well, Mike asked me if that was Mama's signature." And then he didn't say anything again. I said, "Well, what did you say to Mike?" He said, "Well, I told him that's Mama's signature, okay."
Yeah.
And I was drawing it out of him. I said, "Well, what did Mike say?" He said, "Well, if that's your Mama's signature, sure looks like you've got yourself a brother." And from that moment on, he's been unquestioning. He just could not picture the possibility that his mother had a child out of wedlock. And I think it was a lovely thing. He had her on a pedestal,
Mhm.
and he adored his mother. And his final response was, "I guess every woman's got a secret." And he's fine with me and he's fine with his mother.
Yeah.
So
Well,
so
you can
that was
kind of
great.
hear through the process, he has this open heart and he wants to hear and he wants to learn, but it's not quite making sense or adding up to everything he knew. And so you have
Exactly.
to go through that process of, all right, let's bring this into logic and reason and make it make sense. And you can hear that, but
It took a lot of logic,
yeah.
and I honestly don't even believe that her husband knew. I,
Mm,
I think I think this was a secret she carried to the grave with her.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I
Okay.
mean, when our reality is challenged, it is difficult to change our mind and recalibrate and accept and wrap our heads around something that's different than we've thought our whole lives.
Yeah, this was an abrupt departure from his
Yeah,
reality for sure.
yeah.
Absolutely, for sure.
One thing I love is how you just had the desire and love to persist and build this relationship with him and connect. That's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, his life at the time we entered it was his universe was pretty small.
Mm,
As I said, he had been in between hospital and the assisted living center, he had consumed 28 months of rehabilitation.
Yeah,
And so he had his wife who he had met in the facility. He had his friend Kevin, who was the one who had put us together. But everything else, when he had his wife's in-laws or her family who took pretty good care of him. But otherwise the universe was kind of small. So I think we brought something to it. And I like to think that our mother is pleased with that.
yeah.
So on the other side, we even before I started this search, my wife had always been after me, and I always identified by my adoptive parents' ethnicity. My
Mhm.
father was Sicilian, my mother was Ukrainian.
Mhm.
And with all of the DNA advertising they were doing, my wife kept on saying, "Why don't you do a DNA test?" And the Christmas prior to my starting on this journey, I bought 2 DNA tests, one for myself and one for her, because anything I gave her for Christmas, she would return. So I figured the DNA test was not returnable, or at least not in original form. And so I sent mine in. Ultimately, it came back, and and it came back kind of after I'd been searching and discovering for several months. And I knew a good deal about my maternal side at that point, but little about my paternal side.
Mhm.
And I got my pie chart back, and I was neat. I was certainly not Sicilian. There is a good part of Eastern European there, which could have accounted for Ukrainian.
Mhm.
Surprising 30 odd percent of Ashkenazi Jew,
Mhm.
and then a random mix of Northern European and British Isles. But then they give you a list of all of your relatives, and so I had my closest 2,000 relatives listed there. And at the top of the list was a name I just did not recognize at all. And it was listed as I think they Ancestry put listed as first cousin, close relative.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And if I had known then what I knew now about, centimorgans or amounts of DNA, I would have known precisely who this person was. But uh, I knew that he was not on my maternal side. And if he was my first cousin, then he was going to lead me to who my birth father probably had been. And remarkably, he was a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, who
Yeah.
are renowned for their grasp on family history.
Mhm.
So I looked up his name, and he had a massive family tree already online.
Mm.
And I went to his line. I saw on his mother's side that he had 6 aunts and 1 uncle. And I said, bingo, that uncle has to be my father. So I tried to reach out, and again, in just a matter of good luck, because you hear all stories about people reaching out to these DNA matches and never getting a response.
Yeah.
He was another 5-minute guy.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
he
awesome.
he
Wow, that's
messaged me
great.
right back, and he said, "Wow," he said, "this is really so exciting." He said, I'll be happy to help you search us in any way that I possibly can. So, so I messaged him back, and I told him about my theory of his uncle Harris Loftus. And I said, because of this and this, I expect that your uncle is my birth father.
Mhm.
And it took a little while longer to get the message back. He said, I understand what your logic is. He said, but what I'm seeing is, number one, you're saying your mother was in San Francisco. My uncle never left Texas.
Mhm.
And I'm seeing that you have 30% Ashkenazi Jewish blood. There is not a drop of it in my uncle's. He said, however, he said, my grandmother was half Jewish, or my grandmother was Jewish. My father was half Jewish, which makes me 25% Jewish, and
Mhm.
you are 25% Jewish. You and I are half siblings.
Oh, wow.
And that's precisely what the
Wow.
story turned out to be.
Oh my
It just
goodness.
kind of that quickly.
Yeah.
So I had I had another half brother, and he told me about his father, or our father, and he didn't tell a very flattering story. His father had abandoned him and his mother when he was about 10 years old. At the time I was conceived, he would have been between his second and third of 5 wives. So, he was a romancer, but he was able to paint me what the connection would have been between my father and Ice Follies. So, how he and my mother would have met.
Mhm.
And excuse me, About a year later, we went out and we visited with him in California, and he said, if you don't mind, my mother would like to meet you. And his mother was the third wife, who initially had been very concerned with the timing of, of my conception and her marriage to the man who would ultimately be my father. But she ultimately realized that he and she did not meet until afterwards. And we came in, and she was just another very bright, vivacious woman. And, we were introduced, and she, she met my son, met my wife, and then told her son, why don't you take them and show them the house? I want to talk to him, pointing at me. And she took the next half hour or so just telling me everything she could about my birth father.
Wow.
And yeah, the majority of it not terribly positive, but trying to explain, what it was that made him the person that he was.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was somebody who didn't have to do something like that,
Yeah.
but just was generous and kind enough to share what she could about somebody who I would never meet, and I had never known. And I thought that was a really nice thing. And my half brother told me from the start, I don't know who raised you, don't know who or and how you grew up. You likely did much better than if my father had raised you.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's kind of a sad thing to hear from someone.
Mm-hmm.
But again, very truthful. And and my half brother grew up. He's a very talented musician. He was a talented technologist who worked for Stanford University for a long period of time. He's just recently retired, and so it's been lovely in that I inherited another brother. I grew up an only child, and
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
wound up with a couple of brothers, and and he said the same thing. He said, I always wanted a brother.
Aw.
So it was good. We stepped into another life and maybe fleshed that out a little bit.
And so you keep in touch now?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably not as frequently as I do with Ted on my mother's side, but
Mhm.
when we talk, for a long periods.
Oh, that's so awesome. What an incredible journey that you went on. There's so much to it. The richness is just so deep. What would you say your biggest lesson or takeaway is from this whole entire experience?
My biggest takeaway, and it was unexpected, is that if you had asked me before I embarked on this, tell me about adoption,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I probably would have told you a woman gets pregnant, that's a given, but for one reason or another finds it necessary to surrender a child.
Mhm.
And she does that. And at that point, I think that's where my explanation to you would have ended. In researching and learning about my mother and telling her story, and then subsequently making contact with other people in the adoption community, I got a very, very strong sense of what leads up to making the decision to surrender a child, what happens emotionally when you do surrender a child. And then probably the biggest piece of all is that, once you surrender that child, it doesn't end there.
Right.
You live with that probably for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And I wrote this book, and with that in my mind and on my heart, have started writing another book, because people said, well, what did Genevieve do next? They wanted the travelogue portion of it. But I've started interviewing, any opportunity I get, women who have surrendered children for adoption, to talk about what was your experience like, what is your experience like today. And all of them basically tell the same story and talk about the same 4 or 5 emotions that they experienced at the time they surrendered,
Mhm.
or subsequently. So I'm kind of writing the sequel from 2 aspects. One is, to satisfy the what did she do next piece. The other piece, in a series of diary entries, talking about, I'm in Cincinnati, I'm with my friends, but here's what's on my heart right now, or here's what's triggered a thought.
Yeah.
And so that's my takeaway is what the bravery and the burden I think that a first mother carries with her throughout her life.
Mm.
Yeah.
I just think that's so beautiful that you are taking from this journey that next step of, and I want to create this other book and write this other book, which shares all of these things that you just said. Because, as you're sharing your story, I cannot help, and I mentioned it earlier, but see all of it unfolding. One, you're a great storyteller. And two, just the journey itself is amazing. And I think that's in part because your heart, I mean, you can just tell you're a really kind and warm person, and your heart notices those little details. You seem to see people, and you see what they're going through and what they're giving, and you recognize their kindness and you recognize their gratitude. And it comes forth in your storytelling because of your heart and your view and your vision of the world and your experience. So it's not surprising to me to hear you say something based on that, like, and now I'm going to go do this because I want to help,
Yeah.
maybe other people understand what I've come to learn. But I can't help but think that both your moms would be very proud of you and all that you've done through this journey.
But that's very kind of you to say, and I like to think, and I'm not a terribly religious person, but I still have the belief that somebody is sitting someplace, and whether they're looking from above you, or around you, or up at you,
Mhm.
they're seeing and they're knowing. The book has been a gift. This second journey now has been a gift as well. As I've met a whole bunch of new people who have turned into lovely friends, and these are again, these are women who've given up children, and they tell a very difficult story, but but they want to communicate it themselves, and they're happy to share, and to share their own bravery.
Well, and just the healing that must bring them, one, to share it, to be able to know that their voice can be heard, because a lot of times people do keep these things secret and private, and they don't feel like they can talk about it, and they worry about judgment or all the other things that could come their way. And so just being able to share it would be healing, but also to hear from you specifically, who's been on the other side, that can say, but look, my life was good. And, I'm recognizing how difficult this decision was for a mom to make. And, I can see so much healing coming from that.
I hear about the judgment and the
Yeah.
secrecy a lot. You're very insightful that way,
Yeah.
and that's a pain to a lot of these people, is that they've had to keep secrets, or if they didn't keep secrets, they were judged for for what they did. And every experience is different.
Mhm.
There's a very large part of what they now call the adoption constellation that that feels pain as a result of having been part of it in some way, either having been forced to surrender a child,
Mhm.
having been taken from what you assume were parents who could have loved you,
Mhm.
or well, yeah, you can gather all the pieces of it.
Do you have a working
That
title yet?
I don't it's
Stay tuned.
I've been thinking about that, but I need to do some more work before I deserve to put a title on it.
Yeah.
I sort of call it an unreliable diary, in that I've got notes of my mother's, I have the interviews of these other women. So quite honestly, I am fabricating the diary entries,
Mhm.
much in her voice,
Yeah.
and much in the voice of these other women who have told me a very common story. The voices are different, but the story is very similar.
Mhm.
Person to person to person.
That
And
So,
sounds very unique way to portray it. I
well, we'll
really,
see.
yeah.
Everyone's advice is don't write an experimental book. but it's sort of, I tried I tried it in kind of a standard format, and it just didn't work for me. And
Yeah.
we'll see if this one does.
I love the idea of it. Of course, I'm one reader slash, whatever in the world, but I think that's a wonderful idea because also people say, write what you know, right?
Yep.
And so this is what you know, and these women's hearts. And in the books that I've read, and actually in my book as well, I have a couple of journal entries, and people always say to me, ugh, when I got to the journal entries, I had to dig out the Kleenex.
Yeah,
So they're personal and they're touching.
sure there.
Yeah.
So, just I'm excited for that. I'm excited to read this book. Like I said, we only got to kind of glance over. So looking forward to that. For people who want to find your book, learn more about what you have going on, where should they find you?
Well, the book is called The Gift Best Given, a memoir.
Mhm.
It's available pretty widely. I'm happy to send out signed and personalized copies from my website at dgangiauthor.com, and payment can be made there via credit card or PayPal.
Yeah.
The book is available on all of the online online retailers. And Amazon is the biggest of those, but certainly the Barnes and Nobles and the Kobos of the world.
Yeah.
It should be available through any independent bookstore. They can order it for you. And for those who prefer to give their business to their local library, the book is on Hoopla for download, and it's also available on Overdrive if your library is a subscriber to it.
Right.
And it's available both in softcover version as well as an ebook. So it's out there. If you're interested in reading it, it should be available to you.
Wonderful. Well, you are just a pleasure, and it has been an honor to spend this time with you today and to hear just your story and your heart. And, I think our day is going to be brighter after just talking to you.
Well, mine is as well, Jenny. Thank you so much. And Daniel, you as well.
Yes, thank you. You're
It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for it.
Oh my gosh, I just love him. I could have spent all afternoon talking with him. You hear about people who are amazing storytellers, and his ability to tell a story just leaves you hanging on the edge of your seat. He's weaving, even in conversation, forget about the written book, like he's weaving this story, and I'm like, but what's next? What's next? What's next? And so I just love him and his heart and all he's doing. And I especially love that he is taking what his takeaway has been from this journey and using it to continue to connect and help other people in the adoption community.
Yeah, he's so loving and compassionate. That really comes out in his intent to connect with people and to have those people he's met connect. It's just such a beautiful thing.
Thank you for listening to That's the #Truth. Remember to catch new episodes every other week on your favorite podcast channels. To learn more, visit us at jennymuscatel.com or muscatelministries.com.